Why don't you speak English properly? 17-year-old Jake Martinez sneered at the school groundskeeper, imitating her slight accent. Margaret Collins just nodded politely and continued planting marigolds, her weathered hands steady despite the mockery. She'd been dealing with disrespect for 8 years at Lincoln High, ever since she'd traded her CIA badge for gardening gloves. But when Jake and his friends found themselves face to face with armed intruders an hour later, they discovered that Margaret's quiet voice could command a room, and her weird habits might just save their lives. From which city in the world are you watching this story unfold today? If this tale of hidden strength resonates with you, consider subscribing for more stories of unrecognized heroes walking among us. Margaret Collins arrived at Lincoln High School every morning at 6:45 a.m., 15 minutes before her official start time. She unlocked the maintenance shed with practiced efficiency, her movements economical and purposeful. At 62, she moved with a slight limp that most attributed to age, though the truth was far more complex. Her salt and pepper hair was always pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her clothes were chosen for function over fashion. Sturdy work pants, long-sleeve shirts that covered old scars, and boots that had seen better decades. The students barely registered her presence. To them, she was just another fixture of the school grounds, as permanent and unremarkable as the flagpole or the bicycle racks. They called her the old lady who doesn't talk, or sometimes Maria, despite her name being Margaret, a mistake she'd stopped correcting years ago. The few times they did interact with her, it was usually to complain about something, the sprinklers getting their designer sneakers wet, or the way she'd moved their abandoned belongings to the lost and found. What they didn't see were the details that would have told a different story. They didn't notice how Margaret's eyes continuously scanned the perimeter while she worked, cataloging every person who entered or left the campus. They didn't observe how she positioned herself with clear sight lines to multiple exits, or how she'd memorized the daily patterns of every security guard, teacher, and administrator. They didn't realize that her tool shed contained items that had nothing to do with landscaping. A comprehensive first aid kit that could handle trauma surgery, communication equipment that operated on frequencies the school system didn't use, and a locked cabinet whose contents would have raised serious questions. Mrs. Patricia Hendricks, the vice principal, was one of the few staff members who made an effort to interact with Margaret. "How are the roses coming along?" she'd ask during her morning rounds, always receiving the same polite response. "Very good, Mrs. Hendricks. Thank you for asking." Patricia had tried numerous times to engage Margaret in longer conversations, curious about her background and how she'd ended up at Lincoln High, but Margaret had perfected the art of answering questions without revealing anything meaningful. "I worked different places before," Margaret would say when asked about her previous employment. "Government work, you know. Very boring." It wasn't technically a lie, though it was perhaps the greatest understatement ever uttered within the school's walls. Tuesday mornings started like any other. Margaret completed her usual security sweep disguised as routine maintenance, checking that all gates were properly locked, noting which windows had been left open overnight, and observing the arrival patterns of staff and early students. She was kneeling by the front flower beds, installing new marigolds that would bloom bright orange by homecoming season, when Jake Martinez and his crew arrived for their zero-period class. Jake was 17, built like the linebacker he was, and possessed the casual cruelty that sometimes comes with being young, popular, and completely unaware of life's real dangers. His friends, Connor, Dylan, and Alex, formed his usual audience as he spotted Margaret working in the dirt. "Hey, old lady," Jake called out, loud enough to draw attention from other students filtering onto campus. "You missed a spot over there." He pointed to a perfectly maintained section of lawn, grinning at his friend's appreciative chuckles. Margaret looked up briefly, nodded, and returned to her planting. The dismissal only encouraged Jake. "I said you missed a spot," he repeated, stepping closer. "Don't you understand English? Or do you only speak Mexican? I understand English very well. Thank you. Margaret replied quietly, her accent barely detectable to most ears, but apparently offensive to Jake's. Why don't you speak English properly? Jake sneered, putting on an exaggerated accent that bore no resemblance to Margaret's slight inflection. Maybe you should take some classes before you get this job, you know? Learn to communicate properly. His friends laughed, and a small crowd of students began to gather, sensing the entertainment value of watching the popular athlete mock the groundskeeper. Some looked uncomfortable, but none intervened. Margaret continued working, her hands steady as she patted soil around the marigold roots. I'm talking to you, Jake pressed, emboldened by his audience. It's rude to ignore people. Didn't they teach you manners wherever you came from? Margaret set down her trowel and looked directly at Jake for the first time. Her dark eyes held something that made him take an involuntary step backward, though he quickly covered the reaction with more bravado. I apologize if I have offended you, she said, her voice calm and measured. I am simply trying to complete my work. Your work? Jake laughed. Lady, you dig holes and water plants. A trained monkey could do your job. What Jake didn't know was that Margaret's simple work had kept Lincoln High safe for 8 years. Her careful positioning of security cameras had been disguised as irrigation system maintenance. Her insistence on trimming hedges in specific patterns had created clear sightlines for surveillance. Her daily walks around the perimeter weren't about checking sprinklers, they were security sweeps that would have impressed any federal facility manager. Margaret had been Maria Esperanza before she became Margaret Collins, and before that she had been Agent Santos, one of the CIA's most effective field operatives in South America for 3 decades. She spoke 7 languages fluently, had survived 4 assassination attempts, and had successfully completed operations that remained classified at the highest levels. Her slight accent wasn't from Mexico, as Jake assumed. It was from Colombia, where she'd spent 12 years infiltrating drug cartels and terrorist organizations. But Jake saw only an old woman with dirt under her fingernails. Come on, Jake, said Emma Rodriguez, one of the few students who occasionally said hello to Margaret. Leave her alone. She's just doing her job. I'm just having a conversation, Jake replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. Isn't that right, old lady? We're just talking about communication skills and job performance. Margaret stood slowly, her movement controlled despite the pain that shot through her left leg, a permanent reminder of the IED that had ended her field career 8 years earlier. She was 5 feet 6 inches tall, unremarkable in most ways, but something in her posture made Jake's friends take a step back. You are correct, she said simply. I am here to do my job. Now, if you will excuse me, I have work to complete. She turned back to her flowers, effectively dismissing the confrontation. Jake's face reddened at being ignored, and he opened his mouth to escalate further when the first gunshot echoed across the campus. The sound came from the main parking lot, a sharp crack that froze everyone in place for a heartbeat. Then chaos erupted as students screamed and scattered, their adolescent brains struggling to process what they'd heard. Get down! Margaret's voice cut through the panic like a blade, the authority in her tone so absolute that Jake and his friends dropped to the ground without conscious thought. Her accent had vanished completely, replaced by the crisp commands of someone accustomed to life or death situations. More shots followed, rapid fire from what Margaret's trained ear identified as at least 3 different weapons. Automatic rifles, probably AR-15 variants, fired by people who knew how to use them, but lacked professional training. Their patterns were aggressive but undisciplined. Stay down and move toward the building, Margaret commanded, already assessing their tactical situation. The flower bed offered minimal cover, but it was 20 yards from the main building's entrance, with a clear escape route through the side courtyard if needed. Jake raised his head to look toward the parking lot. What's happening? Is that? Keep your head down. Margaret's voice carried the kind of authority that had once commanded respect in the world's most dangerous places. Do exactly what I tell you, when I tell you, and you might live through this. The transformation was so complete that the students barely recognized the woman they'd been mocking moments earlier. Margaret's movements became fluid and purposeful as she low-crawled to her tool shed, returning with items that definitely weren't standard groundskeeping equipment. "Is that a radio?" Connor whispered, staring at the tactical communication device Margaret was now operating with professional efficiency. "Lincoln Base, this is Gardner." Margaret spoke into the device, using a call sign that meant nothing to the students but would immediately identify her to the right people. "We have active shooters on campus, multiple weapons, at least 3 hostile actors. I'm with a group of students near the main entrance." The response crackled back immediately. "Copy, Gardner. Federal response is 12 minutes out. What's your status?" "Secure for now, but they're moving toward the building. I count approximately 200 students and staff who need evacuation or lockdown." Jake stared at Margaret in shock. The woman they'd been mocking was speaking in tactical codes and receiving immediate responses from what sounded like federal law enforcement. "Who are you?" he whispered. Margaret ignored the question, focused entirely on the approaching threat. Through her years of experience, she could read the attackers' movements and intentions. They weren't random shooters. They were moving with purpose toward specific targets, probably the cafeteria where most students would be gathering for breakfast. "Listen carefully," she told the students, her voice calm but urgent. "We're going to move to the administrative building. Stay low, stay quiet, and do exactly what I say. Your lives depend on it." "But shouldn't we run?" Dylan asked, panic clear in his voice. "Running gets you killed," Margaret replied matter-of-factly. "Moving with purpose keeps you alive. There's a difference?" She pulled what looked like a modified smartphone from her pocket, but the screen displayed a detailed layout of the school grounds with moving red dots indicating the shooters' positions. "How do you have that?" Emma whispered. "Questions later, survival now," Margaret replied, studying the display. "They're approaching the main building from the east. We move west, through the courtyard, to the admin building. The walls are reinforced concrete. It's the safest location until help arrives." As they prepared to move, Jake's earlier mockery seemed like a lifetime ago. The old lady who doesn't speak English properly was now their lifeline, displaying skills and knowledge that belonged in military operations, not high school landscaping. "Stay behind me, 5-foot intervals, no talking," Margaret instructed, sounding every inch the professional she'd once been. "If I signal stop, you freeze. If I signal run, you move as fast as you can to the next cover point I indicate. Understood?" They nodded, too shocked and frightened to do anything but follow orders. As they moved across the courtyard, Margaret's transformation became even more apparent. She navigated the campus like someone who had memorized every angle, every possible line of sight, every potential danger zone. Her limp had mysteriously disappeared, replaced by the fluid movement of someone trained in tactical operations. "There," she whispered, pointing to shadows moving near the cafeteria. 3 individuals, armed with rifles, moving in formation. "They have training, but they're not professionals." "How can you tell?" Jake asked, his earlier arrogance completely gone. "Professionals would have secured the perimeter first," Margaret explained while guiding them behind a maintenance building. "These people are following a plan, but it's not a very good one." Her radio crackled again. "Gardner, we have eyes on the targets. Can you confirm 3 hostiles?" "Confirmed 3 visible," Margaret responded. "But assume additional support. This feels like a distraction operation." Even in their terrified state, the students were beginning to understand that their school groundskeeper was far more than she appeared. Her tactical knowledge, her communication equipment, her ability to read the situation, none of it fit with the woman they'd known for years. "Margaret," Emma said quietly, "who are you really?" For a moment, Margaret's professional composure softened. "I'm someone who's spent her life protecting people," she said simply. "And today that includes all of you." They reached the administrative building just as the shooting intensified. Through the windows, they could see other students and teachers huddled in classrooms, following lockdown procedures. Margaret's radio indicated that federal agents were still 8 minutes away, an eternity in a crisis situation. "Why aren't the police here yet?" Connor asked. "They are," Margaret replied, monitoring multiple communication channels. "But they're setting up a perimeter. In situations like this, they wait for federal backup unless there's immediate opportunity to engage safely. So we just wait?" Jake's voice cracked with fear. Margaret looked at him, really looked at him. For the first time since the crisis began, the cocky teenager who'd mocked her accent was gone, replaced by a frightened child who needed protection. "No," she said quietly. "We make sure everyone gets home safely." As sirens wailed in the distance and the sound of gunfire continued sporadically, Margaret made a decision that would expose everything she'd worked to keep hidden. "I need to help the others," she told the students. "There are people trapped in the main building. You can't go out there." Emma protested. "You'll get killed." Margaret smiled sadly. "Emma, I've been walking into dangerous situations for 30 years. This isn't my first time." She opened her tool shed's hidden compartment, revealing equipment that belonged in a tactical operations center, not a school maintenance facility. Body armor, sophisticated communication gear, and medical supplies that could handle trauma surgery. "Holy shit," Dylan whispered, then immediately apologized for the language. "Language is the least of our concerns right now," Margaret replied, strapping on the body armor with practiced efficiency. "I need you all to stay here, stay quiet, and wait for the federal agents. Do not try to be heroes. Do not try to help me. Just survive." "Wait," Jake said, grabbing her arm as she prepared to leave. I'm sorry. About earlier. About what I said." Margaret paused, her expression softening. "Jake, you're 17 years old. You're supposed to make mistakes and learn from them. That's what being young is for. But I was wrong about you. Completely wrong." "Yes," she agreed simply. "You were. But you're not the first person to underestimate me, and you won't be the last. The question is what you do with that knowledge going forward." As she moved toward the door, Emma called out, "Margaret, what's your real name?" Margaret turned back, and for the first time in 8 years, she answered completely honestly. "Agent Maria Santos, Central Intelligence Agency, retired. But my friends call me Margaret." What happened next would become the subject of federal investigation reports, news articles, and eventually, local legend. Margaret moved through Lincoln High School like a ghost, using every skill she'd developed during 3 decades of covert operations. She reached the main building through routes she'd mapped years earlier, avoiding the shooters who were now engaged with the first police responders. Her target was the cafeteria, where she knew dozens of students and staff were trapped. Using her communication equipment, she coordinated with the federal response team, providing real-time intelligence about the shooters' positions and movements. Her years of experience reading tactical situations allowed her to predict their patterns and guide law enforcement to optimal positions. "This is Agent Santos, CIA retired. On scene at Lincoln High," she radioed to the federal command post. "I have tactical assessment and civilian evacuation capabilities." The response was immediate. "Copy, Agent Santos. We show you as Maria Santos, decorated field operative, medical retirement 2016. What's your current status?" "I'm inside the target building, coordinating civilian evacuation. The hostiles are using the cafeteria incident as cover for something else. Recommend you check for secondary objectives." Her prediction proved correct. While the main shooters created chaos in the public areas, a fourth individual was attempting to access the school's computer systems and student records, probably for identity theft or worse. Margaret's intervention saved not just the students trapped in the cafeteria, but potentially thousands of families whose personal information would have been compromised. By the time the crisis ended, Margaret had coordinated the safe evacuation of over 100 students and staff, provided tactical intelligence that allowed law enforcement to neutralize the threats with minimal casualties, and prevented a major data breach that could have affected the entire district. Jake and his friends watched from the administrative building as their former target emerged from the main building, calmly removing her tactical gear and returning to her groundskeeper appearance. Federal agents approached her with obvious respect, consulting with her as they processed the scene. "She saved everyone," Emma said quietly. "The woman we ignored for 8 years just saved everyone." When Margaret finally returned to check on the students she'd protected, she found them staring at her with expressions of awe, shame, and newfound respect. "Are you really CIA?" Connor asked. "I was," Margaret replied. "For 30 years. I retired after an injury and took this job because I wanted peace. No more violence, no more danger. Just flowers and teenagers and normal problems." "But you could have been killed today," Jake protested. "Why did you risk it?" Margaret looked at each of them. The students who'd mocked her, ignored her, treated her as invisible, and her expression held no anger, only understanding. "Because," she said simply, "you're my kids now. All of you. And no one hurts my kids." In the weeks that followed, Lincoln High School slowly returned to normal, but with significant changes. Margaret Collins remained the groundskeeper, but her role had expanded unofficially to include security consultation. Students who had never spoken to her before now stopped to chat while she worked. Jake Martinez became one of her most frequent visitors, helping with heavy lifting and asking questions about her experiences. The transformation in his attitude was complete. The arrogant teenager had been replaced by a thoughtful young man who understood that strength comes in many forms. "I keep thinking about that morning," he told her one afternoon while helping plant new roses. "About what I said to you." "What about it?" Margaret asked, not looking up from her work. "I was so wrong. About everything. About you, about what matters, about what strength looks like." Margaret paused in her planting. "Jake, can I tell you something I learned in my other life?" "Sure." "The most dangerous people I ever met were the ones everyone underestimated. The quiet ones, the overlooked ones, the ones who seemed harmless." She smiled. "Never assume you know someone's story just by looking at them." "Is that why you stayed quiet all these years?" "So people would underestimate you." "Partly," Margaret admitted, "but mostly because I was tired. Tired of violence, tired of danger, tired of being someone else's weapon. I wanted to be just Margaret, the groundskeeper who takes care of flowers. And now," Margaret looked around at the campus she'd protected, at the students who now saw her as a guardian rather than an obstacle, at the life she'd built in the shadows. "Now I'm still Margaret, the groundskeeper who takes care of flowers," she said. "But I'm also the person who makes sure those flowers, and the people who walk among them, stay safe." 6 months later, Lincoln High School dedicated a new garden in honor of the events that had changed everything. The Margaret Collins Memorial Garden, named for the woman who was very much alive but had agreed to let them honor her service, featured varieties from around the world, including Colombian marigolds that bloomed bright orange every fall. A small plaque near the entrance read, "In honor of those who serve in silence, who protect without recognition, and who prove that heroism comes in many forms." Students often found Margaret there in the early morning hours, tending the plants with the same care she'd once used to protect nations. She was still quiet, still unassuming, still easy to overlook if you weren't paying attention. But now, everyone was paying attention. Jake Martinez, now a senior, had changed his post-graduation plans. Instead of pursuing football scholarships, he was planning to study international relations and possibly join the State Department. "I want to serve," he told Margaret one morning while helping her water the roses, "like you did." "Service comes in many forms," she replied. "The important thing is to serve with honor, with purpose, and with the understanding that true strength often looks nothing like what people expect." As she worked in her garden, surrounded by students who now knew her story, Margaret reflected on the strange turns life could take. She'd spent 30 years in the shadows, protecting strangers in foreign countries. Now she spent her days in the sunlight, protecting the future in her own backyard. The flowers bloomed brighter, the students walked taller, and Lincoln High School remained a place where an old woman with dirt under her fingernails could still save the world, one student at a time. Sometimes the most important battles are fought not by soldiers in uniform, but by guardians in work clothes, who prove that heroism isn't about recognition. It's about being in the right place, at the right time, with the skills to make a difference. And sometimes the person everyone overlooks is exactly the person everyone needs.